Welcome everyone to this presentation about the next-generation SOC. My name is Nick Metropolis and I'm a SAN certified instructor and the current lead author for SEC 555. And I want to talk to you about how we can actually tackle the next generation of threats. Now, one of the most important types of challenges that we deal with in environments today is the abundance of possible tools that we have, but also the abundance of problems that we have to solve with their tools. Challenges like having an environment and thinking about going from an on-prem mentality to a cloud mentality. And if I do that, do I go with Microsoft Azure or do I go with AWS or do I go with Google Cloud or Alibaba or whichever other type of cloud provider out there? And then what types of tools do I include into the mix? Do I have a budget to be able to have all of these bells and whistles that you see appearing here? Can I have multiple complexity levels attached? So can I use, for example, my packet-free filtering firewalls and possibly my stateful inspection firewalls, and then also expand that to the application layer firewalls as well? Could I potentially have IDSs and IPSs to be able to monitor and possibly block attacks occurring, for example, because of malicious payloads that the attackers are using? And if I do that, do I carefully vet the content of all of those tools and all of those signatures in order to ensure that I don't drown the SOC in alerts? Now, take it from someone that has been doing this for a couple of decades of his life. Trying to deal with alerts is very, very challenging. The more alerts we have, the more the challenge grows. There's nothing that analysts hate more than having too many alerts to deal with. See, the more tools you have, the more logs you get. The more logs you get, the more visibility you think you may have. But having more volume doesn't necessarily make it credible information, or at least it doesn't make it tangible information. Because you can have a football field of alerts, but if I make you try to find that needle in the football field, it's going to be very, very difficult. So one of the things that we have to think about is having quality content. In SEC 555, this is one of the very first things that we deal with. So the current challenge we're trying to solve is what types of logs should we adopt? What types of content should those logs include? What things should we exclude, and how to take that into account in order for us to have quality alerting take place? This is one of the analyst's dilemma, or the threat detection engineer's dilemma, that we are trying to solve. Now, things become even more interesting today with the arrival of social engineering being enhanced by using things like Microsoft VASA or any other type of AI tools out there, in order for an attacker to be able to do a call, and being a young person, they can look at someone being old, or we can hear someone, for example, having another gender voice, or we can hear someone being all sorts of things. So again, the landscape becomes more challenging to deal with. The emails that attackers craft that have malicious attachments or malicious links, they also become more difficult, more complex to deal with. So because of that, that becomes a never-evolving problem that we are trying to solve. Not to mention the disgruntled internal employee, the deliberate attacker who is effectively bumped because they haven't gotten a promotion, or they haven't gotten the salary increase or the bonus they were expecting, thus trying to harm the environment from within. All of those are types of challenges we are trying to solve today. And that makes the question of, well, what should we do in order to solve all of these conundrums? Well, there's a variety of different tools that we could include, as you've just, of course, seen me say, but there's some things that we should definitely think about and grow with them. So having a big data lake today, in order for us to store data and have enough data to be able to create patterns, is very, very crucial, because that will allow us to be able to identify deviations from those patterns, which can give us an indication as to something malicious possibly happening. Having SIEM tools with credible threat intelligence information, with credible user behavior analytics behind them, being able to learn from what's going on in the environment is also extremely important. So when you have your tool and it gets constantly updated with content that your content engineers are creating, when you have rules that are being retired because they're not relative anymore, when you're in a position to deploy endpoint detection and response tools across the board, that becomes a very, very big game changer in the defense game. And see, I see this all the time with clients. So when we have discussions, someone will say, well, we don't have the budget to be able to deploy DR across the board. We can only deploy AV across the board. Or someone will say, well, we can deploy EDR tools, but we can only deploy them at the servers. But then my question is, when something malicious happens from a user-generated activity, so someone clicking on an email link, someone clicking, for example, and opening a malicious attachment, you don't expect them to do that on the server, you expect them to do that at an endpoint. Case in point, I remember a very, very funny situation with a client environment where someone was clicking on an email link and it was a very blatantly seen phishing email. I mean, any average person should have been able to identify that. But I'm always very skeptical about these things. And I spoke to the user and I said, how come did you end up clicking on that? You know what they said? I was treadmilling, I was running on the treadmill and I didn't pay too much attention. I just click on that. And that's where those tools come in order to, of course, save us. So being able to have the appropriate technologies in place can help, but it doesn't mean that it's, of course, the one and just one solution that you need. There's all sorts of things that you should consider. So for example, if I give you threat intelligence information, would you be benefiting if I give you a list of 100 IP addresses and you block them because we think they're malicious? Not anymore. Long are those days, they're gone. So you're not expecting us to give you stale information or information that you have to play whack-a-mole with all the time. You want us to do better. You want us to be able to be in a position to understand the environment and be able to give you credible information. So if you only run a Linux shop or a Mac shop for that matter, what good would it do you for me to give you all of the information about the new Windows vulnerabilities? It won't. And I have a handful of clients, honestly, that have taken that mentality on board and they're deploying particular type of device or a particular, should I say, type of device and operating system combination in order for them to reduce the possibility of exposure. Sometimes I will see folks coming and saying, well, I want you to install a 6 word processing engine because I need it. Really? You need 6 different software types to be able to actually process information, to draft, for example, a document? Why do you do that? So personally, I'm not fussed about someone using 6 or 60. I'm trying to save the environment from having another problem to deal with. If you have 6, then probably it's, if not 5, it's definitely 4 more than what you need to get the job done, which means that you're opening yourself up to a potential vulnerability. We want our tools to be able to perform vulnerability scans continuously in the background in order to tell us what's going on in the environment. But we want tickets to be created, hopefully in an automatic manner, in order for matters to be addressed. So for example, in multiple client environments, irrespective of the particular vulnerability scanning tools they're using, I always work with our DevSecOps teams and engineering teams to ensure that we create integrations in tools like ServiceNow or Jira or any other ticketing tool for that matter that they may be using, in order for those vulnerabilities to translate automatically to incidents that need to be addressed. So the tools can actually push the appropriate level of information, the criticality, they can push whatever we tell them to push across, and they can assign these things automatically to the appropriate team. Now, isn't it magic when the tool sees a particular, for example, issue with a switch and assigns it to the network operations center team, but then it sees an issue with a server and it assigns it to the server team. Then it sees an issue with something else and again, the appropriate team is addressed. So that actually works to our advantage. Not to mention that we don't have to waste time afterwards and email people for progress. Try to assess if, for example, something has been done by calling or messaging or whatever. We can just use the tickets in order to understand when something was raised, how it was raised, who is working on it, if anyone, and properly, of course, follow up. So that also brings us to the area of trying to lay in as much automation as possible. For example, one very, very important area within any security operations center environment is having playbooks in order to handle incidents. You know how the military units are performing response in things that happen across the board by having checklists. They have a checklist for pretty much everything. There's a process there and they check those boxes. Technically, when you have a playbook or when you draft a particular set of steps, that's exactly what you're doing. You are making the tool take these steps, follow this path, in order to eliminate the possibility of having mistakes happen, and at the same time you are making it more difficult for some human interaction to potentially lead somewhere where it shouldn't. I've seen analysts copy-paste information in the wrong ticket. I've seen analysts performing wrong analysis because they were looking at the wrong device. I've seen the wrong user being analyzed or remediated, and people, for example, traveling to all sorts of different client environments abroad, not having access to their email because a potential mishap. So the point is trying to automate things to the extent possible, of course, after we do exhaustive testing and we're sure the integration is working, but being in a position to do that eliminates response times, eliminates errors, and of course makes the environment be able to cope better with incidents. If we couple that with new cutting-edge technologies that allow us to be able to learn the network and try to assimilate behaviors today, that creates a very, very powerful combination. For example, in a client environment in Germany, actually, a few years ago, there was a flow of traffic from their internal network that was leading out to an AWS server. Now that AWS server, that particular host name that they had registered, the attacker, as it turns out, it was newly seen. So the environment itself was thousands of users, but there was no one before that particular moment in time that had ever generated a flow of traffic to that single destination. The tool analyzed, saw this destination as being newly registered domain. At the same time, it saw that there was only one machine from the environment, a Confluence server of all things, pinging traffic out, which raised another red flag. Why would a server ping out traffic to another server in AWS, which was newly registered? And we're talking about a third detection at the same time, which was a very big volume of information. So there was a threshold of about 1 gig, and that threshold was superseded because the amount of information the attacker was actually exporting was more than that. Unfortunately for the client, as it turned out, they were exfiltrating their backups. But the tool itself had multiple alerts to be able to dictate to the analysts that something malicious was going on. It was because it was incorporating machine learning in the backend. It wouldn't be able to do that if that capability wasn't there. So that's very, very important. Now, another thing that we all have to think about is making a decision as to transition to the cloud. So, should we go to the cloud or should we not? That's a decision for every given business, a dilemma, if you will, that they will have to tackle individually. But what we can say with definity today is that the cloud vendors, without a shadow of a doubt, they have a variety of different options available. So for example, if I'm going with Microsoft Azure, they have Entra ID, which is the successor of the old Active Directory service that they had in the cloud. So the Azure Active Directory service, and it contains so many different aspects of tooling available for our review. In Sec 555, we teach our students what the different types of logs are, like logs around activities. So for example, sign-in logs, logs around audit, being able to have visibility into provisioning logs. So all of these are different types of elements that exist within Entra ID, and actually you don't even have to configure anything. There's by default out of the box configuration, all of these things are included. Now, in order for you to be able to have alerting and more sophisticated things, yes, you do need additional configuration, but this is a great start. Same thing with all sorts of other tools, for example, that vendors have for us. And it doesn't matter if you're using Microsoft Azure, if you're using AWS and you've, for example, have access to the VPC flow logs or CloudTrail or whatever other type of tool you're using. The point is that the technologies are there. Also, another thing that we should think about is we should embrace the DevSecOps wave that lies ahead of us. So for years, we've seen security teams being decoupled from evaluating source code when we're developing applications, because security was always an aftermath. It shouldn't be. We also see folks busting their heads on the wall trying to deploy things which take them days and possibly weeks. If I go to the engineering team and say, oh, you know what, I need 50 VMs, they'll be like, oh yeah, sure. We'll have those ready in a couple of months for you, and that may be actually potentially optimistic. Well, if we use tools today that can automatically deploy for us, like Terraform and Ansible, then that time and resource, of course, that comes with it, resource collection, I should say, that actually becomes quite reduced. So it won't take us weeks or even days, it'll probably take us hours after you start working with the tools and you get the hang of things before you deploy something. So we should definitely be considering those as being nominal options. Make your analysts work for what is happening in the environment. Make them work for a living hard. You might already have folks that work very, very hard for a living, which is perfectly fine. But my point, proactive threat hunting. Do not make people wait around the environment and lean on the alerting, for example, that the tools have or some blocking capability in order for problems to be dealt with. Always think about that in a different manner. Assume they're already there. Assume that APT such and such is there. Assume that someone is taking data off of the environment. Assume bad. Make the analysts work to try and assess what that looks like. If I tell someone that we're currently having data being exfiltrated to a hostile domain, would they be able to find that? If I tell my analysts that we are seeing data being exported, for example, to an external destination via form of an email or whatever, would they be able to find that? All of these things are very crucial. They allow us to sharpen tools, they allow us to sharpen skills, they allow us to assess our processes for proper operation. All of these things are very, very crucial for the survival of the environment. Now, since we're speaking about the ability to sharpen the skill sets of analysts, what better way to do that than actually give them a cyber range? Christmas is coming in a few months, so it's very, very important to think about all possible gifts to your analysts. Having a cyber range is a perfect gift. What you see here is a snapshot of the cyber range. Now, the cyber range is a project which actually is open source. So you can find it on GitHub, and it represents the first open source cyber range blueprint really in the world. So what you're seeing here is a complete collection of offensive, defensive, reverse engineering, for example, sections, security intelligence. You're looking at something that penetration testers, malware analysts, forensic investigators, threat hunters, security operators, and other folks can use. You can make the devices be more, or you can scale it down and have less devices. The point is, if you actually review the project, the only thing that you need to do is whip the parameters into shape for your environment, for your particular cloud subscription, and you're good to go. Now, of course, you can do the same if you wanted to in an on-prem mentality. It just depends on how you want to maneuver around this. But it's very, very important to have an environment where folks can actually properly assess what's going on in the form of exercises, drills, assessments, vulnerabilities that may exist. How do they impact our environment? How can we create detection rules? What we do in SEC 555 is we teach folks how to create detection rules, in addition, of course, to focusing on what types of logs we should be working with. And a big portion of that is speaking about what associated technologies we need in order for us to be able to do that. Speaking about the cyber range is also something that we include into that mix because it's very, very important. Now, having said that, you saw all of these different functions and you're like, but I don't need all of these things. I actually don't need to have malware analysis and have threat intelligence and have digital forensics and all of these bells and whistles. And that's perfectly fine. But what you need is to make a decision as to what your core functions for your security operations center should be. And I definitely caution you against over-including things. If you've just started, if you have 100 people, 200 people company, 500 people for that matter, and you might need only a handful of these things, that's perfectly fine. Don't over-approach. Try to be good, to really, really good at things as you progress. And that means, for example, for any traditional security operations center, things like reviewing alerts and being able to properly respond to alerts is a must-have. What good would the security operations center be if we had 10 malware analysts and we never have any malware to analyze? And I've seen that. I've genuinely been in environments where there were folks there that were twiddling their thumbs because they could only reverse malware analyze and they didn't have any malware to analyze, which is a shame. So that always is very, very important to assess. Now, Let's go over a few scenarios in order for us to be able to put some things into perspective. The very, very classical one is, what happens if someone's password is leaked? This could happen in all varieties of ways, and a very classical one, I'm sad to say, is someone using their corporate password on LinkedIn and Instagram and Gmail and Yahoo or whatever they're using these days. In those types of situations, the attacker will try and see if the password that is being leaked because of the fact that a vendor has been breached, possibly a person has been socially engineered or whatever the reason. So they'll try to see if that password is actually fitting anywhere else in order for them to compromise that additional resource. But there's ways today to tackle that. So there's threat intelligence tools out there, and I say that with definity because I've done it for clients, that allow us to be able to scour the dark web and try to identify leaked credentials in a variety of different locations. If we do identify a match with, let's say, sans.org, then we can assess if the user exists by being able to have an API call with the domain controller, an integration if you will, and we can assess if the user exists. If the user is still valid, we can take action in order to prompt them next time they log in to reset the password, because their password will be considered compromised due to the leakage that has been effectively taken place earlier. Now, how cool is that? You don't have to do anything. You don't have to create a ticket. You really don't have to do anything to make this happen. The only thing you need to do is the initial configuration, of course, and integration and testing. But after this is up and running, it's a beautiful, beautiful way to be able to actually do things. Now, attackers are not done. They've become more sophisticated. So we say multi-factor authentication, they'll say, I'll hammer the multi-factor authentication mechanism in order for me to be able to log in. If you don't throttle that somehow, then that could be successful. So if the attacker was able, as I said earlier, to get that password somehow, they'll say, right, got your username, got your password because I social engineered you or it was leaked, whatever the case may be. And what I'll now try to do is I'll try to hammer your MFA, kind of like a brute force attack, but on the MFA mechanism itself, in order for me to be able to make it succumb. Now, there's all sorts of different types of options that we can have in order for us to have multi-factor authentication performed. So classical things include when you try to log into a particular system, the system pushes you, so it nudges you on your MFA tool of choice, Google Authenticator, or for example, MFA on Microsoft Authenticator or whatever it is, in order for you to just accept the push. Or it could be an SMS that you're getting, or possibly the tool calling you to tell you the number in a robo voice, so 654312, or whatever the case may be. But now with the arrival of AI and all of these things, everything becomes a bit more challenging. A good way is what you see here on the screen. Prompt the user to take additional action. So you can make it so, especially in a variety of cloud tools, we use this today, you can make it so that you present the user with a particular number, and then the user needs to actually take their phone, for example, on their hand, unlock their phone, which is the first thing. Then they will have to go to the authenticator solution, and they will have to enter the number that they see being presented on their computer, which is much more difficult to be able to defeat. I'm not saying impossible, we hardly ever say that, but it's much better than actually having other ways. Like, what do you think would happen if it's 9 a.m. on a Monday morning? People make a coffee, they make a tea, and especially if they're power users, they log on to a variety of different tools. So if you're getting constant MFA pushes, for example, at 9 a.m. on a Monday morning, that is something that you may be inclined to fall for. And it has happened to folks that are security prone as well, which is why it's important to also have proper training and awareness programs. It's great if you can have the technical countermeasures in place, but education and training is very, very important. And this is exactly why we teach classes at SANS for a living. Now, the tools themselves, as I said, they have a variety of different options, and you see here just a very small snippet of what they have available. So if someone is trying to log on from a location that the tool is considering as being risky, then they can be blocked. If Nick logs on from London, for example, now, and 5 minutes later logging on from New York, yeah, probably haven't traveled from London to New York in 5 minutes unless I'm Superman. So the tools are intelligent enough, especially if we couple them with proper policies, to be able to identify those things. And they have immense amounts of visibility. They can track the user agents, the browsers. So if you see, for example, it's Nick's account, and let's say that you've seen my username and my password and even my MFA, they've all been entered correctly. But this machine that I'm using now is a Linux machine. And for the last 5 years, I've been using a Windows machine. Well, it's either A, that I've gotten a new machine and it's a Linux one, or B, my account is compromised. Now, do you think that someone that has been a Windows user for 5 or 10 years, do you think it's likely for them to get that Linux machine? Maybe, maybe not. So this is just a very, very simple type of approach as to how the tools give us enough, I would say, nudge in order to take things further. I also like the ability of being able to couple this with what tools can do for us from an aspect of incident response tracking and how we increase productivity. So for example, there's all sorts of different tools out there, like ServiceNow is a very classical one that I've used with a variety of different clients. Within those tools like ServiceNow, you can make it so that you have focal points for investigations. So if someone is a Checkpoint SME or a Cisco SME or whatever, you have tickets routed to them due to their capability and skill set because they're matching with their experience. You can have callouts when a P1 priority 1 ticket is present. You can have callouts, for example, to the security leads. No one responds in 1 minute. Security managers escalate. No one responds then. You escalate to the CISO and so on and so forth. And all of these are just examples, of course. But there's immense level of visibility that you can have productivity-wise as well. So you can see if a ticket has been bounced multiple times. And for me as a manager, has always been helpful because why would I see a priority 2 ticket being bounced from analyst to analyst? Why is it that no one wants to deal with this particular ticket? So all of these things are extremely, extremely important for me. So the tools not only allow us to have proper visibility, but they allow us to ensure that we eliminate the time to respond to incidents. And you can use a variety of different combinations. You can have, for example, integrations with messaging applications like Slack or Teams. You can have actual SMSs on phones. You can have all sorts of things. Lastly, don't forget to think about physical security. What good would all the cybersecurity in the world be if someone can just waltz into the server room, plug in a thumb drive and just take all of the information out? If you don't have a physical security and awareness program, you should be thinking about it. In an environment for a client that I was working at, they had an issue where some of their employees, they figured out a way and they configured in a system, they hard-coded it in order for the system to simulate that they were scanning their card without them actually being there. So their cards effectively were being scanned in an office, like let's say Tampa, but they weren't there because their actual logins, you could see them in Office 365 coming from somewhere else in the world. So there were actually a couple of people included into this attempt to defraud the company. So having this proper level of visibility is actually extremely, extremely important. It allows us to be able to understand what's going on in the environment, and it allows us to be able to take things further. Physical security awareness is extremely important because it allows us to be able to have proper visibility as to what's going on in the environment. So always remember that security is complicated. You already know that. Being able to use next generation tools in order for us to have the upper hand on the attackers is extremely, extremely important. If you want more information as to how we deal with logging, with monitoring, with insider threats, with cutting edge tools, you are more than welcome to join me in a Sec 555 session in order for us to take things further. Other than that, if you need to reach out to me, you can use any of these ways that you see present and reach out with any questions that you may have, and I'll be happy to help. Many thanks for your time, and hopefully you enjoyed this short talk about the next generation SOC, everyone. Take care.